Welcome back to another edition of the Locked On Vikings podcast. I am your host, Jordan Reed. You can find some of my work over at InsideThePyline.com, also at ClimbingThePocket.com. With the NFL and the college football season right around the corner, there's a lot of information being posted on there daily. There's a lot of information and articles being posted on there daily, whether that's podcasts or articles in general that you want to check out. So make sure to go over to both of those websites to not only check out my articles, but also a host of other information that's being posted on there as well. So go over to climbingthepocket.com and Inside the Pylon to check out a lot of that information. And the guys over at climbingthepocket.com are doing some really good work. I know Josh Mintz and Miles Gorham, who are two workers over at Climbing the Pocket, are doing some really good work. And they were out at the Viking scrimmage on Saturday night. They have some pictures and some observations that they had or took away from the scrimmage that have been posted since Saturday night, concluding the scrimmage. So make sure to go over and check that out. Inside the Pylon has something that I really like, which is the NFL glossary or the football glossary, where they break down a lot of techniques and tendencies in the college football and NFL game today. So if you're trying to learn some more in-depth stuff about the game of football in general that you may not know about, or you want to brush up on and learn some more about, go over to InsideThePylon.com and check that out. Today's show is strictly dedicated to the guy who I think is the best receiver to ever play in the NFL. And that's Randy Moss, who was officially inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame on Saturday night. He gave a speech, and I thought it was phenomenal. Everything flowed so great. And that's exactly how Randy Moss' career went. Now, it was a bit of a roller coaster. We all can admit that. But if you go back and just reflect on his impact on the game of football and in the NFL, it was just so phenomenal. And his impact was so great. I mean, he has a verb named after him. When you're growing up and you're playing football in the backyard, everyone wants to moss their friend. That's the verb that we used, and he's the only receiver to ever have a verb named after him when you're trying to describe a catch. That's just the type of impact that Randy Moss had, not only on small kids or kids growing up at the time, but media members of the Vikings organization just love seeing him play during his career. He's one of the most electric receivers ever as far as a home run hitter, and a guy that was just unfair to defenses, and he was ahead of his time. And if you have ever seen Randy Moss play, which I'm sure most people have, he essentially saved the Vikings franchise. And what I mean by that is he was so exciting that he saved the team from moving. Red McCombs, who was the owner at the time and came previously before the Wilfs, was threatening to move the Minnesota Vikings out of Minnesota because he felt like the team just wasn't profiting there and there just wasn't enough excitement. But along came 1998 and along came Randy Moss, and he completely changed the narrative of the Minnesota Vikings, and they did a complete 180 turn when he was drafted in 1998. On the subject of the 1998 draft, Randy Moss, throughout his speech, just kept thanking Dennis Green, who was the head coach of the Vikings at the time, and rightfully so. Randy Moss experienced some troubles in his upbringing out of Rand, West Virginia, which is a small town that he grew up in. If you go back and watch the 30 for 30 on Randy Moss called Rand University, he talks about Rand, West Virginia, and just how tough the upbringing was there for him. Everyone there was experiencing poverty or just poor elements to live in of some sorts. And he kept thanking his mom during his Hall of Fame speech because she had to work multiple jobs just to keep food on the table for him and his siblings and just to keep the lights on in the house as well. Their upbringing was just so tough. And every athlete that he had ever known out of Rand, West Virginia, just did not make it out because the elements were so hard to make it out of. Growing up on the streets, not having any direction or guidance, usually resulted in them failing or just staying in Rand, West Virginia, and not making it out of those tough elements. So Randy Moss was just so thankful in his speech to make it out of those elements with the direction from Dennis Green, his wife, of course, and his mother. The 1998 draft was just so the 1998 draft was such a monumental moment in his career because that is the first opportunity where he did have an interaction with Dennis Green. Now, he did know him prior to the draft, of course, but the 1998 draft was where Dennis Green showed his full trust in Randy Moss because he took a chance on him when other teams weren't willing to do that. And he talked about this on Adam Schefter's podcast, which was posted on Tuesday, this past Tuesday. And he went in depth about how the Cowboys were the team. He thought the Cowboys were the team that he was going to ultimately be drafted by. They had the number 8 overall pick, which they eventually used on Greg Ellis. And he thought that Jerry Jones was telling him the truth, and that's exactly where he was going to go to. And he wasn't expecting to slip all the way to the 21st overall pick, which is where the Vikings selected him in that draft. So on draft day, he's taking Adam Schefter through exactly what's going through his mind. And, he had some doubts on whether he would get drafted in the first round because the Cowboys were saying they were going to select him. And all the teams after that just weren't willing to take a chance on him because they didn't want to deal with the bad reputation that he had. And they didn't know if they could trust him because of his struggles at Florida State and then Notre Dame before he ended up at Marshall and just lighting the record books on fire and just putting his career at Marshall into perspective. In 28 career games, he had 54 touchdowns, and he scored at least one touchdown in every single game that he played. So that just speaks to how big of a value he was and how monumental his career was at Marshall. And he was just a player ahead of his time. And I like to say that Randy Moss was a cheat code because that's essentially what he was during his career. He just didn't look like he needed to be on the same field with the other guys because he looked like the guy that was older than everybody else because even at his pro day, his numbers were just ridiculous. He had a 47-inch vertical. He ran a 4.25 40-yard dash, and he measured at 6'4", 215 pounds. So a guy that big in stature, moving that fast against guys that were on the same field as him, and against guys that were on the same field as him and the same competition as him was just phenomenal. But just going back to the 1998 draft, he took Adam Schefter through that whole experience, and he was saying that the Cowboys were the team that he wanted to go to. He was saying that the Cowboys were the team that he always wanted to go to because that's the team that he grew up cheering for. He loved Jerry Jones, and he always wanted to wear the star on his helmet. He saw Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin, and Emmitt Smith, and he wanted to be added to that trio. So just think about adding Randy Moss to that trio at the time. That would have been just ridiculous. But the Vikings got very lucky. He slipped to them with the 21st overall pick, and he fell into their laps. And it saved the Vikings franchise. I can't say that enough because the impact that he had as a rookie was just ridiculous. And a lot of people can say that they seen it coming, that he would have that type of impact early on, but many people did not trust Randy Moss because of his past at the previous universities that I alluded to earlier, and they didn't know if he was going to mess up again. That was the whole reasoning, that was the whole underlying reasoning why he slipped so far like he did in the first round. And a guy of that talent, you would not expect to fall that far in the draft because the instant impact that he had, not only on the field, but off the field as well, is something that we probably won't ever see again from a wide receiver. And everyone likes to bring up the Thanksgiving game in 1998 against the Dallas Cowboys, where he had 3 catches. Where he had 3 catches for 163 yards and 3 touchdowns. And to this day, I still think that's the most impressive Thanksgiving performance ever from a wide receiver because every catch that he had resulted in a touchdown. And a lot of people forget that he had a 2-point conversion catch on that day as well. So that's just one of the funnest games ever to watch from Randy Moss. And And that's just one of the funnest games ever to watch from Randy Moss's time in Minnesota. And that was just in his first season. So that just speaks to how big of a huge impact and that just speaks to how big of an impact he had on this fan base. He ended his career. He ended his NFL career with 982 catches, 15,292 yards, and 156 touchdowns. So his numbers are probably second to none outside of Jerry Rice, who a lot of people like to argue that was a better receiver than Randy Moss, but that's a different discussion for another day. I don't want to get into that. But I think Randy Moss is the greatest receiver who ever played. And why do I say that? No other receiver on the field had an impact like Randy Moss did. Now, he might not be as great of a route runner or technician like a lot of other great wide receivers were in the NFL, but if you talk about a guy who defensive coordinators and defenses in general felt completely threatened by or they were scared of, it was Randy Moss. I don't think a player or I don't think a receiver in NFL history put fear in defenses like Randy Moss did during his time in his career. Randy Moss's rookie season was so impressive that the Green Bay Packers in the 1998 draft drafted 3 cornerbacks. So that just goes to show you not only the teams in his division feared him, but everyone around the league feared Randy Moss. He put that fear in defensive coordinators' hearts, and they wanted to make sure that they were prepared to defend him every way possible. So they backed their defenses up. They played 10 yards off of Randy Moss, at least 10 yards. And they just feared his speed and his vertical threat. And they feared his speed and his threat as a vertical threat. They feared his speed and his reputation as a vertical threat so much that they had to draft extra defensive backs and they had to back their defense up so far that they wouldn't allow Randy Moss to get behind him. So that just goes to show you the type of impact that Randy Moss had. So that just goes to show you the type of impact that Randy Moss had, not only on the game in general, but kids growing up in the backyard. He had a verb named after him. Whenever you're going up to make a catch, everyone likes to say that I mossed you. He's the only wide receiver to ever have a verb named after him. And that's another thing that speaks on the impact that Randy Moss had. It wasn't just that he was having an impact on the NFL game. He was impacting kids growing up. He had an impact on the Minnesota Vikings for moving at the time, which is what Red McCombs threatened to do before he was drafted. Red McCombs is the previous owner before the Wilfs took over. But Randy Moss had a verb named after him, and that's something we've never seen from any other wide receiver around the NFL and NFL history. So that's just another aspect that Randy Moss brings to the table when you're talking about the impact that he had throughout his career. Before we move on to dissecting Randy Moss's Hall of Fame speech, I want to remind you guys that I know it's some. Before we move on to dissecting Randy Moss's actual Hall of Fame speech, I want to remind you guys that I know sometimes it's hard to go to the gym, but Nordic Track has a series of training equipment that gives you amazing workouts in the convenience of your home. There's a special offer for Locked On Vikings listeners to get $75 off of your Nordic Track purchase by visiting NordicTrack.com. locked on and using the offer code locked on. So you guys make sure to go over and check that out. They have some really good offers going on with Nordic Track. Again, the special offer for that is locked on. Again, use the special offer code locked on to get $75 off your purchase. Before we move on to dissecting Randy Moss's Hall of Fame speech, before we move on to dissecting Randy Moss's Hall of Fame speech, I want to remind you guys about Nordic Track. There's a special offer for Nordic Track listeners to get $75 off your purchase by visiting NordicTrack.com/locked-on. Again, make sure you head over to NordicTrack.com and use the offer code locked on. They have some really good offers going on at Nordic Track, and just want to remind you guys to make sure to go over there, head over to their website. They have some really good things going on their website, and you can get $75 off your next purchase. Again, use the special offer code locked on. And welcome back, guys. And welcome back. And welcome back, guys. Oh my God. And welcome back. We're going to continue to dissect the career and the Hall of Fame speech on Randy Moss. Again, Randy Moss got inducted to the NFL football. Again, Randy Moss got inducted into the Randy Moss just got inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame on Saturday night, where he made his speech in Canton, Ohio. His speech was so truthful, and you could tell it was very heartfelt. He talked about his mom and his wife, all of his kids and his nieces and nephews were in attendance. And he just constantly kept talking about his upbringing. The entire city of Rand, West Virginia was there in attendance, and he made sure to shout them out. He's a guy that loves his city. He constantly shouts them out because just the life lessons that his city taught him, and his upbringing was so tough, as I alluded to in the first segment of this podcast. His upbringing was so tough. He experienced poverty. He wasn't a kid that was privileged growing up, so he had to play in the backyard with a lot of his friends and experience poverty. His mom didn't have a lot. She had to work multiple jobs. And this was one of the biggest motivational tactics behind why he was so motivated to get to college for free, because he knew his mom could not pay for it. And if he didn't find a way to go to college for free or on scholarship, he was going to be trapped inside the city of Rand, West Virginia. And that's what he talked about in the 30 for 30. Rand University. And that's what he talked about in the 30 for 30. And he constantly kept shouting that out in his speech as well, because it takes you behind the scenes of a lot of things that you don't know about Randy Moss. It takes you through his high school track, his upbringing as well, and everything that happened not only at Florida State, but Notre Dame, and when he got to Marshall as well. And I want to touch on that a bit, because it looked like Randy Moss was really going to fail in his college. He didn't have any guidance, but that's what his mom offered him. She was so disappointed in him at Florida State and at Notre Dame, when he just constantly kept getting in those legal troubles, because that's just not who the guy that she raised. And he knew that. He knew that he was failing his mom. She had worked so hard to put him in these positions to succeed, to help him go to college for free, and help him become the athlete that he eventually turned into. And that light finally clicked on when he did get to Marshall. And he had a phenomenal year there when he was at Marshall. And that led into the 1998 draft, which we got into earlier. But Let's talk about his NFL career a bit and when he first got to Minnesota. But let's talk about his Hall of Fame speech. His Hall of Fame speech was so great. I was glued to the TV along with all of Minnesota and all fans from around the NFL as well. Of course, me being a biased Vikings fan, I think he had the best speech of the night. His was so authentic and so heartfelt. He takes you through his entire career. He actually goes in order of how he played. He talks about his time in Minnesota, New England, and then ending it with Oakland, and then ending it in Oakland, San Francisco, and Tennessee as well. And then he talks about ending it in Oakland, Tennessee, and San Francisco as well. So those are just some of the things that he got into, and I really appreciate that he shouted out each and every team. I really appreciate that he separated each and every team and gave his heartfelt appreciation for each and every owner as well for giving him a chance. He's a guy that's so humble, and his mindset has done a complete 180 from that time he was in college when he first got in Minnesota and ending his career in San Francisco. His entire career track did his entire mindset did a complete turn. He wasn't that real ignorant guy that he did grow up being in his time in college when he was at his previous two stops before Marshall. And now during the latter half of his career, he turned into just that humble guy that really knew he was good and he was unstoppable. And now he still has that confidence. And that's what you saw at the podium. He didn't look nervous or anything at all. He didn't play that way when he was in the NFL either. So he's a guy that was always very confident, and he stood up there and he gave a phenomenal speech. And I loved everything about it. And a lot of people were upset at the end because he thanked Bill Belichick, which is a guy who had a very important moment in his life as well. The Patriots were another team that he thanked as well. I forgot to include them earlier. My apologies. But he had a great run in New England as well, where he set some more records as well. And they ended up losing in the Super Bowl that year when they were trying to obtain the perfect season. And I really hate that Randy Moss didn't end up with a championship. And that's really something that's only missing. That's really the only thing that's missing from his resume. But his career is already. But besides that, I think his career is already a record-setting one. But besides that, I think his career is already a historic one.